The next chapter I'm going to cover is on Chapter 11, which is talking about the use of presentational aids to assist in your speech. So there are several different types of presentation aids. The first one is actual items like a fairy figurine or a bottle of Febreze or a stuffed animal. Then you have models, so things that represent other items like a model of an atom or a model of a molecule or a model of the human eye. You have photographs and drawings, which are fairly straightforward, and you have different types of multimedia you can use, things like video and audio, so movie clips or radio recordings or things along those lines. And then you also have the use of multimedia, which are things that range everywhere from PowerPoint presentations to an actual recording of yourself giving a speech. What makes something multimedia is if it uses more than just video or just audio, if there's other things incorporated. Then you have the most common types of presentational aids you see, which are charts, tables, and graphs. Graphs come in several different forms. The most common ones are line, bar, pictographs, and pie. I don't really want to go into too much detail about visual aids because I feel like this is something we are all fairly familiar with, and because you will only have to use a visual aid one time, and that will be in your persuasive speech. You're trying to figure out what type to use. There's several different things you should take into consideration. The first is to establish their purpose. What is the purpose of your visual aid? And it should never be because you have to have a visual aid. Visual aids should always serve a purpose. They should always fit the topic. They should always be something you can use and are comfortable with. They should be relevant to the audience, and they should be right for their situation. Most importantly, your visual aid must be additive to your speech. So what I mean by that is, if you are giving a speech about puppies, having a stuffed animal puppy dog that just sits there is not an adequate visual aid. The visual aid needs to support your thesis. It needs to be added. It's something that helps better explain a situation or explain something you are trying to share with us. And it must be something that is not only referenced in your speech, but it must also be something that is a representative of your speech. It has to be something that you cannot describe in words, which is why you have to have the aid. And it must be something that is sharing something with us that we don't learn any other way. Something else is very important to take into consideration when you're choosing your visual aid is what is available for how you display them. So if you're going to have a visual aid that requires multimedia, that requires a PowerPoint presentation, for example, you have to have a way of showing that presentation to the audience that will allow them to be able to see the visual aid and understand what's going on. And a downside to visual aids too is that if you use something that requires media, is to always have a plan B in case the media doesn't work, the media malfunctions, or the media isn't available. Again, if you have something like a poster or a picture, you have to figure out a way to hang it or to show it so that everyone can have access to it. So you have to consider how you will display them. So there are several methods for displaying your visual aids that can change or alter what visual aid you may choose. Do you have access to a chalkboard or a whiteboard? If you're going to do a poster, how are you going to hang it or how are you going to show it? If you have handouts, you have to make sure you have enough for everybody who is reading them at the time. If you have flip charts, you have to make sure you have a stand that will allow you to show the chart and be able to flip it without it being sloppy or looking bad. With advanced technology, you have to make sure that you know if you have access to contemporary media, so computers or things of that sort, or if it's more traditional media, overhead projectors, slide projectors, things along those lines. if those are the only things you have access to, that will also affect what media you choose to use. A few important things to keep in mind when you are making your presentational aid. Make sure you follow good design principles. You want to have unity, pattern, balance, emphasis, rhythm. So on that note, you want to make sure that your visual aids are big enough for us to see, that they aren't too cluttered so it's hard to understand that what's going on, that you put emphasis on the right things, that it looks right. So if you have a big poster board and you only use the upper left hand quarter of the board, it's going to look weird having 3/4 of empty space. Also, if you have a visual aid where it's a very detailed picture but it's tiny, or it was printed on a low resolution printer, it's going to be hard to make out what it is. Same thing with text. If you have text on your visual aid and you use 12-point font, it's going to be hard for people in the audience to read it. They say typically the smallest font you want to use when you're making a visual aid is 16-point font, but anywhere in the 24 to 32 is the best to make sure that the entire audience will be able to read it. Then the other major tip for crafting successful financial aid, or crafting effective presentational aids, is to make sure you give yourself enough time to be creative, and that you give yourself enough time to actually make a quality visual aid. I've seen far too many visual aids from students in the past that I could tell were thrown together 15 minutes before they gave their speech. Visual aids that were sloppy or off-centered or not cut clearly, or the pictures were fuzzy, or PowerPoint presentations where there were tons of typos and all that was on the PowerPoint were words that the speaker were already saying, so it didn't add to the speech. All of these things make for a weak or useless presentational aid. So make sure you give yourself enough time to do quality work on your presentational aids. Several tips are in place to help you make sure that you have the strongest presentational aid that you can have. So there are a few major tips that I want to make sure that you keep in mind when you're looking at what aid you're going to use and how you're going to incorporate into your speech. Please, please, please proofread your visual aids if you are going to have text on your visual aids. A simple misspelling or a simple typo can be very distracting to the audience. Make sure that you preview your aid, that you take a good look at it to make sure that it's everything that you want it to be. Make sure that you check the equipment. So if you're using presentational software, make sure you're picking ones you are familiar with. And on the day of the speech, make sure you get to the room early enough to check the equipment to make sure everything is going smoothly and that everything is working the way you want it to work. Know when you're going to display your aids. Write that down on your note card. Show aid, cover aid. So on that note, make sure that you also know when you are done displaying your aids, your visual aids. I've had students where they had a picture that had to do with their first main point, and then 3 minutes later they're on their third main point, which is completely different and has nothing to do with the chart from their first main point that they were showing, and yet that chart is still up there, and that's distracting for the audience. So make sure you plan when you go back to neutral, when you get rid of that aid, and when you are going to show the next aid. So make sure that you know when you are displaying them and when you are removing them. There's a tip that is don't pass visual aids around, which is more applicable if you're in a room giving a speech versus the online speeches you'll be submitting. You really won't be passing visual aids around, so that's not that important now. But know that whenever you pass something around, it gives the audience something to be distracted with. This next one is important. Use the touch, turn, talk method. And so what they mean by that is if you have a visual aid you're referencing, turn towards the visual aid, touch the point you want them to know, then make sure you turn back to the audience to talk to us. Don't ever turn your back to the audience to point while talking, to point out or to mention something with your visual aid. You should always be talking to the audience. So take a short talking break, look where you want to point to it, turn back to the audience, and start talking at that point in time. So again, I repeat, don't turn away from the audience to look at or gesture towards your visual aid while you are talking. If you have to do it to find something specific, that's fine. Make sure you look back to the audience before you start talking again. Prepare a backup plan. See, even here, I didn't carefully proofread my visual aids, and there's a typo there. So prepare a backup plan in case the computer doesn't work or you spill coffee all over your visual aid. What are you going to do? And then, super, super important, when you are practicing your speech and you have a visual aid, practice your speech with your aid. So stand up, put the aid on whatever presentational platform, table, easel, what have you, and practice your speech with your visual aid so you can get comfortable with when you turn it one way, when you turn it the other way, when you flip it, when you put it up, when you take it down, because all of these things are going to take time, take skill, take practice to make sure that they happen as fluidly as possible. If you don't practice with your aids, they are going to throw you off when you go to present with them. And if they throw you off, then you are going to have a higher likelihood of messing up on your speech, not doing as well, getting flustered, getting more nervous. It's just going to impact the quality of your speech. So do yourself a favor and always practice with your visual aids. So in a nutshell, that's what Chapter 9 had to say about presentational aids. That is the end of the last chapter for Tab 4. So you can go ahead and take the quiz on this tab now that you've completed this lecture. Good luck with the quiz, and know that I am starting to grade your introduction speeches, and I will get those to you as soon as I am able.